I'm Karl Weigl in America, or Karl Weigl, and I'm very proud to reminisce a bit about my grandmother, Vally Weigl. My sister, brother, and I always called her by her chosen nickname, Vally Muti. So she was our Vally Muti. I knew her as a child, of course, but then as a young man, when I lived in New York City, very near her for 3 years in the mid 1970s, I would say in kind of as a capsule that Vally was multi-talented woman, a musical whirlwind is what I would say. She was a composer, a peace activist, a translator, a pioneer in music therapy, as well as a lifelong champion and advocate for the music of her husband, Karl Weigl, for whom I am named. Fundamental to everything she tackled, she had her underlying belief in the power of music to transform. In terms of personality, I'd say she was exceptionally strong-willed, determined, focused, and driven in everything she took on, and that was a lot. She was truly indefatigable. I'm not sure what the German equivalent of that word would be. Or to use a current American expression, she was a force of nature, with her boundless energy poured into her activities with ceaseless energy. These qualities served her well, of course, when they were forced with the necessity of fleeing Austria in 1938. She was the one who made it possible for them to move to America, to emigrate. So backing up a bit, Vally was born in 1894 and was raised in a well-to-do Viennese family in the First District. They were assimilated non-practicing Jews. Her 1-year younger sister, Käthe, later Käthe Leichter, earned her PhD in economics, became a prominent social democrat, a fierce advocate for women's rights, and an anti-fascist political activist. But she did not survive the war and was murdered in the camps in 1942. Their father, Joseph Pick, was a banker and an amateur musician who discovered and encouraged Vally's musical talent from a young age. She studied musicology, became a proficient pianist, and then applied her knowledge by teaching piano, which was her first job. As a youth, Vally was athletically very active, a skier, an enthusiastic hiker, and even a little mountain climbing, I am told. Though, through this, she developed a lifelong love of nature, which found expression in much of her music. She married her composition teacher, Karl Weigl, in 1921, and my father, Wolfgang Johannes, was born 5 years later. The three of them lived in a three-room apartment within her parents' flat, until they were forced to flee Austria. While Vally continued to teach piano, her focus in those Vienna years became more as an advocate for her more introverted husband's music. As his chamber and orchestral music became more widely performed throughout Europe, his prominence growing until his career was curtailed by rising anti-Semitism in the early 1930s. A little bit about their life in exile. With the help of the Quakers, the big help of the Quakers, the Weigls managed to emigrate to New York City, where they lived on the Upper West Side. Always amazing to me, they were able to transport much of their Viennese furniture and even Vally's Bechstein piano, which had been a gift from her parents. I wrote this recollection of their apartment a few years ago, so let me read this. As a young man, I would visit my grandmother in that apartment where she resided for 40 plus years, the ambiance essentially unchanged from the way they established it upon first arriving in America. The experience for me never really changed either. Entering the unfamiliar but dignified, and to my sensibilities vaguely quaint, recreation of a bygone era. Overstuffed formal settee, uncomfortable straight-back chairs, imposing wooden chests stuffed with manuscripts, a little tea cart used for serving sherry, tattered turn of the last century rugs, matching cloisonne vases atop the heavy bureau, hanging pictures of old Europe before the war, the halls and walls lined with endless rows of first edition books in German, and the ever-present portrait of Beethoven looming over and not quite welcoming visitors to the apartment. He lived there until her death in 1982. Once in America, they immediately began building a network from scratch. For all those years, Vally made a living as both a piano teacher and a translator, never a permanent job for her, but she, like Karl, were relentless in their pursuit of any ways to make money. After Karl's death in 1949, Vally devoted most of her energy to preserving and promoting her husband's music, using her connections and sheer willpower to arrange many performances and recordings, all the while struggling to make ends meet for herself. A serious shoulder injury in the early 1950s was trigger for an entirely new profession for Vally. During rehabilitation, she developed a sense of music as having healing power beyond the transcendental power to entertain. She returned to school, received a master's degree from Columbia University in psychology with a focus in music therapy, which was just then an emerging field. Then at the tender age of 60, she became a passionate teacher and lecturer, wrote multiple articles, and attended conferences worldwide, always exploring, applying, and sharing methods that she was pioneering for helping mentally retarded, those stricken with cerebral palsy, and emotionally disturbed children as well as adults. As evidence of her creative energy, in 1963, Vally actually designed and patented an auxiliary keyboard to be mounted on a conventional piano to facilitate playing by the physically disabled, especially those with cerebral palsy. Her aim was to encourage improvement of self-expression and therefore emotional well-being among those with debilitating physical limitations. Sadly, no prototype was ever developed. Let me talk a little bit about the Quaker influences on Vally, which was quite substantial. Vally was deeply involved with the Quakers. Not only did she honor them for their invaluable help with the Weigls escaping persecution, the Quakers were fundamental to Vally's search to identify and promote peaceful solutions to the world's ongoing conflicts. He regularly attended Friends Meeting in New York, and through the Quakers expanded her circle of like-minded people. A young friend at the time, Gretchen Watts, described Vally as, quote, belonging to the activist/intellectual wing of the Quakers, not the contemplative wing. She was a woman of action. She expanded her peace activist activities through affiliations with other peace groups. Plus, she was an ardent letter writer to local and national lawmakers, particularly during the Vietnam era, when in addition, she attended anti-war protests and marches, even though for those she used a cane. She believed intensely in the necessity for equality of expression and the recognition of dignity for all peoples. Through the Friends, Vally co-founded Arts for World Unity, an organization whose purpose was to promote peace by unifying people through music, dance, and poetry, in the hopes that the arts will build understanding across people of all political, religious, or cultural affiliations. She was president of this organization for 10 years. Her determination is well expressed by this quote. Quakers Quakers have only within the last 4 or 5 decades become more aware of the power of the arts, but they are more and more realizing it and responding to it. It is my heartfelt hope that Arts for World Unity will survive and continue to speak to friends and others of that God in everyone. Let me speak a little bit more about her personality. She had a magnetic personality. Vally created for herself a wide circle of admirers, and I would say the word acolytes applied to many. She would invite students from the Juilliard or the Manhattan School of Music and have them over to her apartment for social gatherings and serious discussions on whatever the topics of the day were, music, politics, whatever it happened to be. When I lived in New York, I attended several of these, and I always remember she would pour everyone a tiny glass of sherry as a ritual start to that day's conversation. She could be charming and persuasive, often using such opportunities to convince these young musicians to perform her or Karl's music. That way, she would leverage her magnetic personality for everyone's benefit, an opportunity for these people, these young musicians, for their exposure on stage, plus furthering her own musical agendas. Let me speak a little bit about what I see as her legacy. Along with her own composing, which gained its greatest exposure in the 1970s, plus her peace activism and music therapy pursuits, she remained the chief advocate and champion of her husband Karl Weigl's music. And perhaps most important, he was an aspirational role model and inspiration for an unknown number of young women as they struggled to assert their own independent identities and create their own professional paths. Always aware of her mortality, her energy never flagged. She was in perpetual forward motion. She was driven on all fronts well into her 80s. And she never looked back. To my knowledge, she never discussed the past, and my guess is that she didn't dwell on it either. Of course, the exile experience must have rattled her to the core, so that without doubt, I imagine she lived with an overriding life goal to do what she could to prevent what happened to her family ever occurring again. I'll leave you in the end with this personal memory, a mental image, if you will, of Vally, something I wrote a while back. What I recall most about her musicality is her sense of rhythm, and as an extension, her intuitive physical connection to other people, being attentive to how they moved, how they expressed themselves, how they responded to her and their environment. She would pick rhythmic patterns from thin air and punch them out with her fingers against an invisible instrument as she spoke, pulling others into a shared experience with a satisfied and knowing smile. In my mind's eye, I still see her jabbing her fingers to her internal rhythm, encouraging this shared connection and pleasure. That was my Vally Moody.